Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Beck with the Eden Alternative. Thanks for joining us today. We are really excited to bring you today's event, which is Ageism in the Era of COVID-19. We have an awesome panel. Today, you're going to hear from every one of them before we're finished, and we're hoping that we're going to hear from you as well. So make sure that you make good use of that comment box. I want to start out by offering a big shout out to our sponsor today. And our sponsor is With It. And this is an exciting movement intended to disrupt ageism, brought to us by Parker. Parker is a large organization on the East Coast that has many senior living communities, and we're really grateful for Parker and their creation of With It. Mind you, the email address, not the email, but actually their their address is wearewithit.org. If you want to check it out, you might want to go there and do that at some point during the broadcast today. So with that, I would like to begin by introducing everyone who's on the panel today. And I'm wondering, Tracy, if you want to go first and tell us a little bit about yourself.
I would be happy to. Thank you. So hi, everybody. My name is Tracys Research, and I am an associate professor and chair of the Department of Gerontology at Virginia Commonwealth University, which is in Richmond, Virginia. I have a master's in gerontology, which I've had for about 25 years, and I have a PhD in developmental psychology. And my area of real interest in research and advocacy has been around ageism for quite some time. And it was a personal kind of aha moment that I had probably about 10 years ago that really set the stage for this and prompted this for me when I realized how deeply invisible ageism was and how I myself, even as a trained gerontologist, othered older people and didn't consider myself somebody that was part of the aging population. And that was my big aha moment, saying this is something I want to learn more about, and this is something that I want to do more about. So it's been the focus of my research and my community partnerships for many, many years now. So thank you so much for having me here.
Oh, so great to have you here. Kirsten, what about you?
Hi, my name is Kirsten Jacobs. I work for Leading Age, and it's a treat to be here today. Leading Age is a national association of not-for-profit providers of elders services, housing, and supports. So our members are busy doing the really important work right now. I have the privilege of supporting that work from a knowledge perspective. So I'm on the knowledge team, and our work focuses on providing and developing education and content for people in the field. Leading Age's vision is an America freed from ageism. So as an organization, we have said, ageism is making our work more difficult. How can we make it better? And so I get to work for an organization that cares about ageism, but also personally, certainly have my own passion. And I think it stems from my education and work to becoming a social worker with that strong social justice grounding. So it's a treat to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Penny.
Thanks, Lauren. Hi, everyone. I'm Penny Cook, and I'm the president and CEO of Pioneer Network. And for 23 years, Pioneer Network has really been working to change the culture of aging and support, really moving away from that institutional culture and really moving away from the institutional way that we look at aging as well. And one of the things that we've realized is even though we've been working at this for so long, sometimes we haven't made all of the strides that we wanted to make because there's a barrier. And we really believe that ageism is that barrier that's been in our way. And so this is such an important topic for the work that we do in changing the practices and the philosophy. And so for 23 years, Pioneer Network has been working to change the culture of aging as well. And I think it's more important now than ever. And personally, this has just been near and dear to my heart for over 30 years now. I've worked in the field of aging. And as a social worker, just like Kirsten, this is just something that's ingrained in me, that social justice piece. So I'm so pleased to be here. And thank you to the Eden Alternative for hosting this.
So great to have you, Penny. And Jill.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jill Vitale-Awesome, and I am the president and CEO of the Eden Alternative. And much like the other folks here and organizations here, the Eden Alternative has been working to improve quality of life for older people and their care partners for 25 years. And you can't do that without addressing ageism. And it's really at the root of a lot of the issues that we all face as we get older, and that our organizations face as we get older. So I'm thrilled to be here with this esteemed lineup. And Laura, I want to point out that one of our heroes, Ashton Applewhite, is here watching. Ashton is the author of This Chair Rocks, Manifesto Against Ageism. So Ashton, thanks for being here with us, and everyone else who's joining.
I'll also add that I see that Kyrie Carpenter is here from Old School, which is a fabulous online resource for all kinds of ageism education. So that's something you might want to check out. A lot of free resources there. Awesome. So I think it's pretty obvious from the title and the description of this event why we're here today. We have, all of us, been in the world of aging for a long time now. Ageism isn't new to us, but it's becoming much more of a household word since the pandemic has become an issue, and we're seeing a lot of fear stirred up and a lot of really egregious acts of ageism, comments, things that really disparage older people. And so we're hoping that today we can shed a little light on how this happens, why this happens, maybe how we can unpack it, deconstruct it. And I thought we should start by coming up with a shared definition, or maybe more than one, of ageism, so that everybody can be on the same page in terms of what we're talking about and what exactly this word means. We have lots of people on the line today. Tracy, I'm wondering if you could start.
I'd be happy to start. And that's a great question, because ageism is so big and so nuanced all at the same time. So I think for me, in terms of its broadest definition, it is very simply discrimination, oppression, marginalization based on age. And I think it's important that we take that broad definition, because while it is disproportionately impacting older adults, you do see ageism against younger people as well, and that's all ageism. So it's important that we recognize that anytime there's an oppression against somebody based on age, it falls under that. I think what makes it so nuanced and complicated is that it presents itself in so many different ways. So it's about the language, it's about the acts and the behaviors and the discrimination, but it's also about multiple layers of identity. So it's about how we feel about ourselves as aging people. That can be called internalized ageism. It can be how we relate to older people and the reciprocity in those relationships. We call that relational ageism. It could be about how we either value or devalue people based on age. That's kind of a social identity or a social relational ageism. So it's really transactional and interactional, and it happens at multiple levels, so within person and within relationships. But then the other thing that's really fascinating to me about ageism as an identity is that it's one of the few that changes over time, right? When we tend to think about intersectionality and we think about our different forms of identity, not too many of them change over time, but our aging does. So how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to other people is something that is constantly evolving. And that's the other thing that makes ageism, particularly both interesting and damaging at times.
Well, I think it's also interesting too, because Tracy, I love, when we talk about ageism, it is that broad definition, right, that we're looking at. And then we look at ageism in relationship to what we're experiencing and seeing today. And there's this definition that I love from the Collins Dictionary. And it's basically that ageism is unacceptable behavior that's a result of valuing younger people more than older people. And I just think about that in relationship to what we're going through and what we're seeing and hearing today. And that's that more specific definition of ageism as it relates to growing older.
Who else would like to add to this?
So I'll throw one in there, and this is from Todd D. Nelson, and I love this definition so much. And it is that ageism is prejudice against our feared future self, right? And it's just such an interesting definition to use. And it kind of explains some of the things we see sometimes, where as we get older, we may even have more prejudice against people who are older than us because of what we fear for ourselves as we get older. So I always love using that definition. It makes a lot of sense.
Great. So I would like to reflect for a moment on some of the things that we've been seeing. Obviously, we've been seeing lots of different comments being made. There have been certain acts that have taken place. Would any of you be willing to offer some examples of some of the things that we've seen that are perfect examples of what you've just defined in terms of the pandemic?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and start. There have been a couple of things that I think have been particularly egregious in nature, which have really sparked the desire to have this conversation and have more conversations like it. So the fact that we had a trending hashtag called Boomer Remover is one, and I hate even bringing attention to it, but it warrants it in this kind of conversation, that there were enough people to think that this was a disease that disproportionately affected older people and that was okay, right? Well, they're old, so why should we make such a big deal out of this? That's one example. And then, really, really disturbingly for me was how then it tripped into several of our politicians saying that older adults should be willing to sacrifice themselves for the state of the economy. And that's just another really blatant way of saying that we don't value the contributions of older people and that we see them as more disposable. So those are the two that come to mind off the top of my head.
I would jump in with, with what Tracy just said. If this virus impacted younger people disproportionately, would we be handling it differently in our society? Would you have people pushing back against doing all these things to stop the spread of the virus? I think you're absolutely right with it's only impacting older people, so it's not quite that scary. The other thing we're seeing a lot in our field with all these organizations that are working to support elders is that nursing homes, assisted living, senior living communities are at the bottom of the list for getting personal protective equipment, and they're ordering things and shipments are being intercepted because they need to go someplace more critical. And these folks are trying to keep the disease from affecting more people and keep people out of the hospitals. So it's a really interesting thing we have going on, and how nursing homes are being portrayed in the media when there are outbreaks. Very different.
Well, I think, sorry.
Kirsten. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say that I think that idea that, we've thought for a long time that nursing homes and assisted living communities and the people who work there, along with the people who live there, that they aren't seen as valuable as maybe other segments of healthcare, as other segments of society. And really what we're facing right now just brings that right in front of our face. It brings it to light so much. And I think that's so important to recognize. And then it's that trickle down effect of all those different things you talked about, Jill, but that overarching emphasis on other areas of healthcare besides nursing homes and assisted living communities.
I would just ask to put, we just had a quote from Ashton that was pulled up, this comment, and I think this is so spot on. A society that doesn't value older people doesn't value the people who work with us either. And I think that's a lot of, really what we're seeing right now.
Kirsten, I want to give you a chance. I think you had a comment. Go for it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate this. I think one of the more subtle aspects is this idea that all older people are the same. So we're grouping older people 60 plus or 55 plus, whatever definition you choose to use. But if we do that, that's fueling misinformation as well. Certainly we know that people that are 65 are experiencing this very different than people are at 85. So this sort of manifestation of ageism that all older people are the same just gets us into a slippery space of not understanding what's really happening.
Laura, can you put one more thing in there? Is that okay?
You want to throw one more thing in there? Sure.
Yeah. Another example, and we've been talking about this. We've been having weekly calls with groups of people from all over the world to talk about what's happening in communities all over. But one of the narrative that is out there is the helpless victim, that older people are helpless victims. And there's so much focus, and it's wonderful to have this focus on what can we do for the poor older people that are, in nursing homes or whatever. But it really does say a lot that there are some organizations that are doing this, but how can the folks that are older than us be of service right now, be giving back to society, help us figure out how we can get through this? They've lived a lot longer than we have, and really bring back to society. And so that it's really hard to make that shift because of the way we think about older people.
I also wanted to say, I think it's really important to recognize that ableism is playing a role in this as well.
Absolutely.
Beyond ageism, it is the intersection of ageism and ableism. And just as we devalue people that are older, we devalue people that have different levels of abilities. And that is a part of it. Yes, there's so much heterogeneity in how we age. No two 65-year-olds are going to be alike. But let's just be really careful as a whole not to make that value based on ability as well, because we all have contributions to make at all levels.
I wanted to point out Emily Nicole's comment. If we could pop that up on the screen, I think this speaks to exactly what we're speaking to. I love this. Listen, the elders that our agency has been connecting with currently are offering reassurance and a sense of greater understanding and wisdom in a time of turmoil. My staff are feeling anxious and brought to peace when checking in with many elders that we serve. There we go, right? So thank you, Emily. Beautiful. So we've painted a little bit of a picture here, right? About the kinds of things that we're seeing. And so for those of us who feel passionate about reframing aging, here's a question. How can we respond to what we're seeing in a way that actually makes a difference without creating more divisiveness or conflict? Any thoughts about how people who feel ready to step into their shoes as activists can respond?
I always think it starts with people personally and really looking at their personal attitudes and the language that they're using. There's such a connection between attitude and action and language, and we know that. And I think the first step was always looking at that personal reaction. And you know what? Everyone's going to have a certain reaction to start with. And maybe one would say at first that it's ageist. But the important thing is to be aware of that and then to really examine what's behind it. And Jill pointed out in her definition of ageism that she loves that fear is, I think, such a huge factor behind why we have ageist attitudes and beliefs in our society. And I think to address that personally is really the first step.
Yeah, brilliant. What else do we have on this? Any other thoughts?
I like building off of, again, Jill's definition and recognizing that we are all aging. So to make this personal, that this is about the you that you are now, but this is about your future you as well, right? So not to think of this as about being about older people, but this is about all of us. And it's really breaking down that us, them mentality. And I would say that, one of the bright spots and the things that I noticed in response to that boomer remover was that for everyone that posted something that was just obnoxious and egregious about boomer remover, there were 5 people that posted something saying, I don't think so. I'm going to call this out and I'm going to call you out. And that truly was very heartfelt and inspiring for me, that people are ready. They're ready to see this and they're ready to call this out and say this is not right.
I just want to highlight, and the box is moving quickly, someone here, Marianne, we have to change the language. I'm 71 years old and being addressed as young lady is insulting. The voice of the elders in this seems really important, doesn't it? So thank you. Thank you, Marianne, for sharing that.
Laura, I wanted to jump in with a comment that came from one of our weekly calls from Jack Cumming, who lives in a life plan community, and he made a really interesting comment, and he said, stop talking about elders as different than you. We are all adults going through a shared crisis. And to me, that really hit me when he said that about, this is a community challenge right now. And it's not about age. Yes, you may be more at risk if you're at a certain age or have certain medical conditions, but it's all of us working together. So I think the more we can stop categorizing people right now, the better off we'll be. And we're also seeing organizations that are doing things where, elders are, rather than, again, being the sheltered victims in this, are really reaching out and doing for society right now, having calls with other elders who are at home alone and need company, reading to kids on Facebook Live. There's so many different opportunities for things like that.
All right, awesome. I'm wondering, Tracy, if I could focus on you just a moment. I know that you've done a lot of research on this subject, and I'm wondering what you could share about what you've learned that might shed some light on what we're experiencing right now in particular.
Sure. Yeah. And that's a big question. So let's see if I can different ways. I think actually the reframing aging research, I think really gives us a great snapshot into the why this is happening, because they talk a lot about cultural models and kind of these really broad buckets of why we believe what we believe about aging. And, what they found in their research was that there's this pervasive us versus them thinking that I mentioned before, and that fuels otherness and separateness. We tend to see older as other, and that drives fear. So, that's one of the things that I think drives this conversation. It's also this pervasive sense that aging is an individual responsibility, so that it all is dependent on how well we take care of ourselves, how much money we save, which doesn't take into account equity, inequity, intersectionality at all. So instead of looking at aging as being about community support, people tend to focus on it as an individual. So I think that's fueling some ageism right now. Well, it's your fault that you didn't well or you didn't exercise. I think there's also this really deep sense of disconnect between real aging and perceived aging. So we tend to see aging in and of itself as a very deficit-based model. And what's complicated about that is that we do decline as we age. We are mortal. We are going to have physical decline. But what we don't talk about so much is the ways that we grow, the ways that we develop, the ways that we evolve. So it's this singular focus of this conversation that's very narrow in scope. And that's really what people are most familiar with. So that is kind of what's leading towards some of this. And then people also think that's kind of, you can't solve this, right? So it's this fatalistic kind of thinking as well. I think the last thing I'll say is we really don't talk much about elderhood. We don't talk much about older adulthood as a state of development that is different from being an adult. So with that lack of dialogue and that lack of understanding comes fear, right? And that's part of what is driving the fear, is that we don't have things to look forward to as we grow older. Well, elders know that they do, right? They're living it, and they have their lived experiences to say, wow, I really like myself a whole lot better now than I did when I was younger because I've grown. But that's not something that's in the cultural discourse, is to talk about this kind of bigger picture life stage that elderhood gives us. So I think these are, kind of the components that come together that have been driving some of the discrimination, the fear, the marginalization that has led us to this point.
Here's a comment from Ashton. Ask people to look at their own internalized bias. A lot of elders didn't want to acknowledge their own vulnerability in the face of COVID. Not that they're helpless, but that age alone does put us in a higher risk group. It's an interesting comment. I also wanted to point out Kathy's comment, great point, that it's all about us. It is the one ism that affects us all. And so, yes, as you pointed out, each of you in your own way, this is deeply personal. So thank you, Tracy. It's incredibly helpful to have that frame of reference. And Kirsten, I was wondering if you would like to piggyback on this a bit and talk a little bit about the role of intersectionality in terms of ageism, especially during the pandemic.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's already come up in that we're at the intersection of ageism and ableism most of the time when we're talking about this work, but there are so many other identities that we all carry around with us. And I actually pulled a quote from Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality. And I think this quote is helpful when we think about this work. And she says, intersectionality is simply about how certain aspects of who you are will increase your access to the good things or your exposure to the bad things in life. So if we think about all these identities that we carry around, and I saw a comment in the quote in the chat about class. So if you're living with a low income, if you're experiencing homelessness, if you are Black or brown, your experience of this pandemic is very different. So we can't separate out our age from all the other identities that we all carry around with us, and how important that is when we talk about a huge universal global experience like a pandemic.
Excellent. I also see another comment here, just along the lines of what we've touched on in the last few minutes. Evie points out that there's a pervasive denial of aging, i.e. the whole 60 is the new 40 thing that we hear frequently. Any comments about that? Anything in regard to this pervasive denial of aging and how that might play into people's angst during the pandemic in terms of the loss of elders, et cetera?
Well, I'll just tell a personal story. I actually have a friend who is in her 70s, and she has been a denier of her age in various ways, openly. You know, there have been times when she's lied about her age. There have been times when she's, used the term "I'm 39 again" and things like that. And it was really interesting for me to talk to her during this time, and especially when the initial news reports were coming out and guidance was coming out that if you're over 60, no matter whether you're 61 or 95, but if you're over 60, then, this could impact you more harshly. And she finally had a phone conversation with me, and she's like, I'm in that group. I'm over 60. And it almost seemed like exactly what Evie was saying, that she was actually in such denial about her age and her aging and growing older for so long that it was this occurrence that actually was almost literally a slap in the face for her. And it was fascinating to watch that. And I think that we're seeing that more and more with people during this.
So in response to what you just said, in the comments, Marianne notes, we have to remove the shame associated with being old. And so, here we are, right? Products of our culture. Shame being a huge part of this experience. Anything about the issue of shame? Just curious. Any thoughts?
Well, you do wonder somewhat if the framing of the frail, vulnerable, everybody over 60, whether you're 100 or you're 60 or whatever, what impact that will have in even furthering ageism more, right? And the fear of being older, because I mean, all the things that we talk about with getting older in our society are just amplified right now. That's what I'm seeing anyway. The frail victim. So I think we're going to have to fight this even more. And Tracy, when we originally talked about doing this, Tracy said, I think this could be a time where we could bring this to the forefront and start addressing it. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, Tracy, a little bit. I loved when you said that.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. I think that is the actual brightest spot that there is that I think this is the catalyzing moment. And when you look back at other social movements and areas of social justice, you look at things like the Stonewall riots, which moved forward LGBTQ rights and you look at, the civil rights era, a lot of them have this kind of catalyzing experience, this thing that happens that shines the light on what we have all seen for a long time, but has really remained invisible and unimportant for so many people. There's a lot of problems in the world. And I think ageism is one that has kind of taken a back seat that, yeah, it's important, but it's not as important. And this is really shining a light on why this matters so much, how this is playing out in an incredible way, not just at an individual level, but at an institutional level, and looking at the structures of our society, including what you were saying before about long-term care, and about the devaluing of staff in long-term care and getting to issues of not getting a living wage and not having access to PPE. And so it's deep. And I think that this could be a catalyzing moment where a light is shining on this. And as advocates, we could say it's time to make this better. It's time to bring some attention to it and really push forward some change.
So thank you. There's a comment from Mel Capola here that I think we might want to give a moment to. There's way too much blame and shame going on. So if someone contracts the virus, people will find a way to blame the person for what they did to get it, much like AIDS. So yeah, this the domino effect of the whole blame and shame thing, right? And so I'm wondering if we could just shine a light a little bit on fear, because I feel like that comment certainly brings up the question of fear. Would anyone be willing to comment on how fear creates a natural breeding ground for intolerance and negativity? Any dots that we can connect there for the people on the line today?
So I'll jump in. I think it's important to note that fear is a natural response. It is something that we should have no shame about, something that we should not blame ourselves or other people for, just like bias. Bias, fear, they are all built into our brains. They are mechanisms that were designed to actually help us because they help us make very quick decisions about what is safe for us and what is unsafe for us. But what has happened is when we live in a world that has so much stimulus being thrown at us, it's very easy to make that super quick decision just based on something very surface. So we can look at somebody, we see what they look like, and our brain is immediately saying this person is safe or not safe. This person is like us or not like us. And that's what fuels the fear. So it's important that we just recognize fear is there for a reason. It's okay for us to feel it. Bias is there for a reason. The trick is to kind of take a moment and slow down our thinking and use our more evolved thinking from our prefrontal lobe to say, okay, let me make an informed decision here, an informed judgment, not that quick super reaction that we have.
All right, brilliant. And yeah, Jill, go for it.
Well, Marianne popped up with this comment that fear causes us to project onto the other. And I was just thinking when Tracy was talking about that, when you're afraid of something, like if I'm afraid of getting COVID-19, I'm going to do everything I can to make myself not like those people who are at risk. So I'm only 50. I'm not old, so I'm okay. They're not, do you know what I mean? And so the more you're afraid of something, the more you want to push it to the side, make it not like you. And I know that's not like a textbook, there are researchers, based definition of it. That's kind of the way I have seen it play out so many times. It happens all the time with individuals living with dementia, right? I'm afraid of dementia, so I'm going to push you aside because it makes me scared.
Jill, I think you have the perfect example of that actually in your book when you're talking about older people othering older people or people with disabilities, and that example of the dining room, that if somebody's coming in who's using any assistive technology, people don't want them in there. Well, why? It's the fear. So I think you do a nice job of giving some examples of that in your book.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I also think, though, one of the other things we have to look at with fear, though, is that limited resources tends to breed fear as well.
Very true.
that it's happening so much. We're seeing it so much with what's going on during this time with COVID-19, and that limited resources is just one more thing. And we're obviously seeing it when we talked about hospitals getting PPE, over nursing homes, and that nursing homes are having such a hard time, and they're competing, and they're sort of at the bottom, unfortunately, of that chain of getting what they need. So the limited resources piece also, I think, is such an important conversation that we need to be having with this.
The whole limited resources thing gets tied into this, crazy conversation about the economy and whether or not we should be sacrificing lives, right, in the name of the economy. And I'm wondering, could I share something with you guys really quick that I found just by happenstance right before we came together? It came out of the Chicago Tribune, and a journalist shared this quick story, which might lead into a question that I wanted to ask you. She mentions in an editorial, a couple of days ago, I passed one of my neighbors younger than I am on the sidewalk. As we stood 6 feet apart and talked, he said, "We just have to accept that a lot of old people are going to die, and so be it. If that's what it takes to keep the economy strong." This is just a talk on a sidewalk. Maybe he noticed my raised eyebrow, because he added that maybe he feels that way because both of his parents have died and he doesn't feel a personal stake in the survival of older people. But he does have a personal stake. This is her speaking. Every generation has a stake in the others. Okay, so here we are, like, this is just walking down the street, right? So this tells us just how deep it goes. And so this brings up a question. Obviously, we've been telling stories about ageism today, and it's not just about younger people not understanding older people. It's people of the same age having the same prejudices. But when we start to recognize the generational divide, what are some of the ways that we can leverage this unusual time to start to heal that divide between the generations? Any reflections on that?
I think one thing we can do is to stop looking at generational labels to begin the conversation and just start talking about people, because in so many ways, these are so arbitrary anyway, right? My sister and I are in different generations, 4 years apart, and our lived experience is quite similar. And we have plenty of other examples of that. So that's one step, but then starting to look at how we as humans can connect regardless of our age, recognizing the strengths that we each bring based on our age and lived experience is one place to start.
Great. What else do we have?
I think oh, go ahead, Penny.
I was just going to say, I think it's been so important, and obviously there are negatives to this also, but it's been so important that now there's guidance out there in so many states that everyone, no matter what, when they go outside, should wear a mask. Everyone. And so I live in a very urban area of Denver, and it's been fascinating now in my neighborhood, which is very age diverse, to go out, and it doesn't matter whether you're a 5-year-old kid or whether you're 85 years old, everybody in between. The majority of people that I see now have masks on. And I have to say, that's a small thing, but I think it's been leveling the playing field in some ways. And it doesn't matter then, as you said, Kirsten, it doesn't matter what generation you're a part of. We've taken all of that out of it now. And it's just everyone, if you go outside, wear a mask. And it's those little things, but I've seen just a difference too in just the interactions. It's not like people are walking away from just one person now. I mean, we're just like walking away sort of from everyone, and people are having conversations from their porches. It doesn't matter age or anything else, those conversations are happening. So I think that leveling of the playing field, even by the mass, is something that's happening and is actually a positive right now.
Interesting. Anyone else?
I was just going to build off of what Kirsten said, which I'm also not a fan at all of generational labels because I find them arbitrary and meaningless. But there's also so many untruths to them. So I think we really can start to see all the things that we do have in common and all of the connections that we have, and recognize that most of those perceived generational differences are really ideological differences. not generational differences, right? It's that we're viewing the world from a different lens. So to me, that's a subtle shift, but an important shift, that we're not blaming millennials or blaming boomers. It's way too heterogeneous of groups to do that. So instead, start to focus on the connections that we have with people based on our shared ideologies.
Beautiful. Thank you. Earlier, there was a comment from Mariah Bernhardt, if we could pop that up on the screen. And I think it's an interesting point of connection. Mariah points out a great opportunity to address our fear of mortality, which directly relates to ageism. And then I saw, I think, Rain saying, yes, let's talk about death. So, I think there is that question about, as a culture, we tend to have a lot of silence around the subject of death. And how does that factor into this equation? How does that impact maybe what we're seeing right now? Anyone want to comment on that?
You know, what we've heard from communities that we work with, and people that are on our calls that we have, is that people who have lived longer and realize that they are mortal have a peace with it that a lot of us don't have when we're younger. And I think the fear of death, it brings us to do a lot of crazy things, and that also leads to the othering of people, right? Well, I'm not close to death. You are. I'm far from that. I'm young. That's why we, dye our hair and do all these things, because we don't want to be close to that spectrum of, the bookmarks of life. But, again, I think there are opportunities for us to call upon wisdom of people who have lived longer and help us to, because we are all at risk right now. We don't know who's at risk and who isn't, right? And so how can we use this time? How can we call upon the wisdom of people who have lived longer to help us get more comfortable with it? And I'm speaking for myself, because I have a lot of things I need to, I need to get comfortable with it. So, that's one of the things. And then another thing, and this is a personal thing, is I'm so terrified of something happening to my parents, because, I'm afraid of them dying too. And so I was noticing myself wanting to step on their toes. They live in a life plan community, tell them, push back against what I thought wasn't going right there, and telling my parents all these things they shouldn't be doing. And I realized that was extremely ageist, paternalistic, and I needed to back myself off on those things. But again, it comes from fear. So much is based on fear, and so much is based on fear of dying and losing people.
Okay. Yes, go ahead, Penny.
I have a question for everybody about that. And do you think, because, as you said, Jill, and I know Kathy Lieblich pointed this out too, that we're all at risk, and we're seeing, and society overall is seeing, people who are younger than we normally would think die. Do you think that actually we're having that conversation more a bit as a society because we are seeing more younger people die? I'm curious about that. I don't know what you all think.
I think the fear ramped up an awful lot, and people started taking things more seriously when it was younger people that started having, terrible outcomes.
And I almost see that as a positive, because then I think that the wisdom that people sometimes have about death as they grow older, like you're talking about, Jill, is something that can be tapped more. And I think that we need to actually be intentional sometimes when we talk about what we can do to actually make those connections for people.
Absolutely. And Mariah put another really good comment in here. Laura, I'm sorry if I didn't step.
No, it's really good. Is it the one common factor that breaks my heart?
Yeah.
Okay, yes. Go for it, Jill. Read it.
The one common factor that breaks my heart is that people of all ages are dying alone from COVID-19. It doesn't matter what age, which is why I think having discussions of end of life is important among generations. And Mariah's so right. And people don't, how do you have these discussions before you're in a critical situation? It's a really important point she brings up.
just like ableism, fear of death is also inextricably linked to ageism. So yes, we need to have all of these conversations. And the more that we can normalize all of these stages, the less fear there will be. And I get that's hard with loss. I've also been more paternalistic with my parents than I ever have been in my life with this. And I will fully admit that to keep them safe. It's something I feel like I want to do.
I feel so much better now. Thank you for admitting that.
You're welcome. But yeah, we don't talk about death nearly enough until we're right there, until we have to talk about it rather than being more planful.
So Kyrie Carpenter has a nice comment here. I hear a lot of people talking about how horrible dying isolated is for the person dying and for their loved ones. I think we will see a lot more conversations about end-of-life wishes after this. It is bringing the conversation to the table, literally. Okay. So speaking about the conversation in general, the one we're having today, I wanted to just circle back around. We touched on this a little bit earlier at the beginning of the conversation. But obviously, there are a lot of people, as we can see in the comment box, who are interested in changing the conversation about aging. And are there any other things that we can do? Any other conversation starters? Any other ways that we can engage people in thinking differently than maybe they, and I'm talking about when you're out there interacting with somebody and suddenly you're presented with a comment that is visibly ageist and maybe, and for me, it strikes at my core, and I know that this person means no harm at all. I'm wondering if any of you have some great tips for how to engage people in maybe thinking about what was just said in a way that isn't shaming or blaming.
So one of the things that I have used before is to kind of question people. So if someone says, wow, you look great for your age, or I haven't seen you, you haven't aged a bit, something like that, I might say something like, tell me more about that. What do you mean by that? Or what does aging mean to you? Or to reframe for someone and say, I think what you're trying to say is that I look really good. Thank you for that. I feel really good. So it's either that slight little reframe, because sometimes it's appropriate to say it with a little bit more assertiveness, but sometimes it's nice to come at it with kindness. And make the assumption somebody is well-intentioned. They want to give you a compliment and they haven't connected yet that that's not actually a compliment, that's just perpetuating this cycle. So a question to a question sometimes work, and a redirect for me will sometimes work.
Great.
I love that, Tracy. I love that reframing, because I think you're right. People don't mean things to be negative. It's just they just aren't aware of what they're saying and what the other interpretation of that can be. So I think to do that gentle sort of reframing is what's so important, because otherwise I think you risk somebody just not listening to you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if you actually just are too firm in what you say, you're not going to get your message across. So I think giving grace to someone and doing that sort of like slight education is so important. And I think it was Ashton who said, ask, what do you mean by that? And it's, asking that question to a question. I think it's very important.
And Mel Capola adds, if we can pop Mel's comment up on the screen, and we seem to be losing Kirsten. I just want to acknowledge that we value her, and I hope that she's able to come back in. I see she's trying really hard. So Kirsten, we're waiting for you. Mel says, yes, we have to find ways to engage with people in an educational moment when we receive a compliment, for example. And so I guess that requires a little, being nimble, right? Being ready for it. But yeah, it's definitely something I know I've been confronted with frequently, and I so want to take care of the person, and I feel like I've missed my moment sometimes. So I thought it would be helpful for people to hear some of the things that others have done. Kirsten, welcome back.
Sorry.
No worries. We could tell you were trying, and I thought I would just check in with you, and I don't want to put you on the spot. the question that we had asked before we lost you was, what are some of the ways each of us have dealt with moments where we had an opportunity to give somebody a different perspective without shaming or blaming? And I'm wondering if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I always appreciate that question. I think the part about not shaming or blaming is so critical because we all find ourselves in those moments. And sometimes the most important moments are the personal ones that I have with myself about raising my own awareness as I notice those challenges internally. But I think I always aim to sort of raise awareness gently and persistently because I think we've all been there and we can all sort of continue to educate each other.
Great.
Can I just add something to that? Because I think that's great. This is a journey. So we have been exposed to these messages that aging is to be feared, that aging is all about decline, and they exist within our cultural space, like everywhere you turn. So I think that no blame, no shame is important, but also recognizing it takes time. To peel these layers away takes a lot of time, a lot of reflection and a lot of work. So I would hate for someone to think, after an hour discussion or webinar, I've got this. No, we still don't have this. I still say things that I'm like, what did I say? Mm-hmm. Like, think about that. So this is definitely something that we have to individually work with over time.
Thank you. That's a perfect end note, actually, Tracy. I just want to make sure there isn't any other burning last comment anyone wants to make before we go ahead and close down. This has been an awesome conversation. Appreciate all of you so much. And Kirsten hanging in there and coming back. That was awesome. I want to again acknowledge With It and to thank them as our sponsors. Again, you can find them at wearewithit.org. And just to tell you a little bit about what you can expect in the weeks to come, we're going to be here every Monday afternoon at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Next week on the 20th, we're going to be featuring Emi Kyoto and Ibasho, an organization that engages elders in powerful ways. And I think that Emi's plan is to talk a little bit about the impact that elders can have in a moment of crisis, which will be really special. And then on the 27th of April, we will have workforce strategies with Eclego. And in May, you can count on some time with Jack York from IN2L to talk about how technology can help us connect at times like this in powerful ways. And I think we're already learning quite a bit about that. It will be awesome to see that through Jack's eyes. So thank you so much, everyone, for being with us today.